Can Japan deter China from attacking Taiwan? That's what I speak with Stanford University military expert Oriana Skylar Mastro about today.
We also look at how the U.S. is expanding its military basing in the Philippines to help deter a Chinese attack on Taiwan.
This is Taiwan Insider. Welcome to the show. Japan could be a game changer in deterring China from attacking Taiwan. What do you think, Chris?
I think it could be, but Japan has very unique defense politics that may prevent them from getting involved.
Well, I recently spoke with Oriana Skylar Mastro, who is a China military expert at Stanford University. She recently visited Japan to talk to top officials there, and she wrote a piece in the Washington Post saying that Japan should help avert a war in the Taiwan Strait. I asked her why she thinks Japan is so key in deterring China from attacking Taiwan.
Well, there's two big aspects of Japan's role that are really pivotal. The first is just how big and competent its military is, and the second is geography. So the United States, in some cases, is outnumbered by China. If you look at the full scope of the U.S. military, you could say, we have more aircraft, but China has more ships. But if you put together the Japanese Navy and the U.S. Navy, then obviously we can outnumber China. It's also the case that geographically, the United States faces some challenges because it's trying to operate from very few bases that are in the vicinity of Taiwan, like bases in the Southwest Islands of Japan. So the United States has one air base in the vicinity of Taiwan, while China has 39 air bases in the vicinity of Taiwan. So if Japan were willing to fight directly alongside the United States in the defense of Taiwan, then we'd also have access to many more locations from which to fight. And this is important not only because of the number of locations, but because of this dispersal, it makes it less attractive for the Chinese to attack those bases, and therefore more likely that the United States will be able to continue to operate in a contingency.
So you recently did go to Japan, correct? And you talked to top officials. So what was their attitude towards your thoughts and your ideas?
I would say I did not receive the warmest reception in some ways. And on one hand, I understand where the Japanese government is coming from. They've made some significant changes in their defense posture. Japan has increased its defense spending, one of the largest surges in spending in Japan's post-war history. They are thinking about acquiring more offensive weapon systems like counter-strike systems, and seriously considering situations under which they would be directly engaging with China. This is obviously all a huge change on the part of the Japanese government when it comes to Japanese norms of how to use their self-defense force. The issue is, and what I pushed some of my Japanese colleagues on while I was there, is that all of these changes extend to the defense of Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So Japan is really interested and now feeling a bit more threatened, and I think rightfully so, that any sort of war over Taiwan could extend to direct attacks against Japanese territory itself. However, there are no real plans or willingness to engage with Chinese forces that are attacking Taiwan only. So to put this in kind of simplistic terms, I asked a lot of people when I was in Tokyo, if there are ships sailing across the Taiwan Strait from the PRC going to land in Taiwan, would Japanese counter-strike forces be willing to target those ships? And the answer there is no. If they do not pose a direct threat to Japan, those assets will not be targeted. And so in my article, what I articulate is, while it's very impressive the changes that Japan has made, I think China believes that it could fight a war over Taiwan without directly attacking Japan in many scenarios. And in those cases, the increases in Japan's military capabilities don't really fall into China's calculus because they won't play a role in a conflict in the Taiwan Strait.
At what point do you think that they would counterstrike against China? Recently in August, China was throwing missiles, across the Taiwan waters, and some of them went into Japan's economic zone. Do you think that if something happened near their waters, that they might react to that?
I think the issue is that they would react to it, but they'd react to the threat that it poses against Japan. So potentially they would do some sort of proportional response to keep those missiles from entering into Japanese territory, but wouldn't necessarily do anything to affect the attacks anywhere else. The issue is that all my work is primarily designed to prevent this war from happening in the first place, right? From establishing a deterrent such that the PRC does not feel like it could take Taiwan at quickly and at an acceptable cost. And so it's not only in Tokyo, but also in Washington that I often hear, oh, don't worry, once the war starts, we'll actually do what needs to be done. But if those policies are not in place before the war, and the PRC does not know that these countries will react in a certain way, then they don't contribute to deterrence. And that's my number one consideration.
So do you disagree with the strategy of strategic ambiguity from the US and Japan?
So I don't disagree with the strategy of strategic ambiguity. The Japanese, like the United States, want to have some ambiguity about how they would respond in certain contingencies. I would argue that the problem is right now there is no ambiguity around one issue, which is their willingness to defend Taiwan. They're very explicit that their new capabilities and their policies do not extend to Taiwan's self-defense. Mm-hmm. What I would like to see is not a promise to defend Taiwan, but potentially a bit more ambiguity about whether their defense buildup and newfound capabilities would be used to defend Taiwan. And so it's not really that I need the clarity that Japan would 100% be there, but I think they're being too clear that they won't be for my tastes. And for the United States, I do think that right now, the PRC is primarily evaluating U.S. capabilities to respond to a quick fait accompli. And so U.S. statements about a willingness to defend Taiwan, I don't think really does much to enhance the deterrent, because it doesn't show that the United States has the capabilities to come to Taiwan's aid quickly. And I worry that it reduces the legitimacy of the U.S. position. I hear in the region a lot lately that U.S.-China tensions are the result of both policies in the United States and in China. And I think the United States, being a non-resident power in Asia, requires countries to support U.S. military operations in these types of contingencies. So if it looks like the United States has also somehow provoked this war, that support might be less forthcoming. And for that reason, I don't support a policy of strategic clarity.
So recently, Japan has made some defense agreements with the Philippines, Australia, and UK. What do you think about these moves? I mean, do you think that they're really getting more serious about responding to a war in the Taiwan Strait?
I think all these multilateral efforts, whether it's Japan signing those agreements, or the Philippines signing an agreement to allow more basing for the United States, or AUKUS, the deal between the United States and UK and Australia over submarine technology, all of those are really crucial moves towards enhancing deterrence. For China, the last thing that the Chinese government wants is to fight a war with the United States and all of its allies and partners. And not even just a military war, the economic costs do enhance deterrence. The issue is that right now, a lot of economic partners of China prioritize that relationship and have made it clear, at least clear enough, I think, to me, and therefore clear to the PRC, that they would be unwilling to cut off trade if China attacked Taiwan. So it's not the case that these countries don't have that power. If China felt like that would be the series of repercussions they would face, I don't think Xi Jinping would consider initiating an attack. And so on one hand, in some cases, the military capabilities we're talking about are not significant, right? Whether or not the Australians fight with the United States does not make or break this war. I argue it's different for Japan, given its location and given the size of its military. But it's not the case that all countries, whether the UK is conducting some operations with the United States or not, that doesn't make or break the conflict. However, those countries' willingness to engage in this type of military cooperation, and thus potentially incurring costs with Beijing for doing so, do demonstrate that maybe they'd be willing to absorb economic costs as well. And I think if Beijing starts to think, especially European partners, which are their number one trading partners, might stop trading with China in an eventuality of a war, then China wouldn't initiate this conflict.
I know you're an expert on the Chinese military. So if China were to attack Taiwan, what kind of strategy do you think it would use?
So I think limited uses of force against Taiwan are almost certain. I don't see things like a blockade or even a joint missile campaign as reunification campaign. So something like a blockade in which China prevents maybe all goods or maybe in much more limited fashion, some goods or delays goods from arriving in Taiwan, or joint missile campaign in which they shoot missiles at Taiwan till the leadership capitulates. Those types of coercive campaigns are extremely risky if the ultimate goal is full absorption of Taiwan, because they take time, they take weeks. And that's exactly the amount of time that the United States needs to come to Taiwan's aid. If the United States does decide in those scenarios to come to Taiwan's aid, then the PRC would be very hard pressed to succeed in actually capturing Taiwan. So in my view, the amphibious assault, actually moving people across the strait and physically occupying Taiwan, is the only reunification campaign that the PLA has. And so if they've gotten to the point where they want to see that reunification, I think that is their only option. And that's what they're primarily focused in terms of training and equipping for right now.
In your article, you suggested that Japan should attack China in that scenario, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this comes up a lot of whether it's different countries, the Japanese, the Australians, or even in the United States, different services, the Air Force, the Navy. They all have this slew of missions. And my question is always, who's sinking the ships? If no one is sinking the ships that are making their way across the strait, you're not going to prevent China from landing. Whether it's, our defense posture, Taiwan's defense posture, the number one goal needs to be focused on anti-ship capabilities. And everything else is sort of secondary to that in my mind.
So if China were to take Taiwan, it would be a big threat to Japan as well, right? So that's the argument that you're making.
Well, so this is difficult. It's very useful, I think, from the US perspective, for Japan to think that China taking Taiwan is a threat to Japan. Whether or not that's actually the case, I think, is debatable. It depends on what you mean by threat. Now, the Japanese obviously see their disputed islands with China, like the Senkaku Diaoyu, as Japanese territory. I mean, those are 100% gone. China takes Taiwan, they absolutely lose those islands and any real access in the East China Sea. If you're talking about a threat to a broader Japan, like is China going to have any designs or threats to Tokyo, or even to the Southwest Islands of Okinawa. I know some people in the Japanese system often say that maybe it's first Taiwan and then it's Okinawa. I don't really see any indications from the Chinese side that they have any desire to expand territory and take those Southwest Islands. But at the same time, it's, in my mind, whatever the Japanese need to believe to get them on board to support this effort is what we need at this stage. But honestly speaking, I think the threat is a little bit less clear. It's there, but it's less clear. I mean, it's the degree to which China gets to determine the future of all countries. That's what we're talking about. Whether they have control over the waterways, control over other countries' policies and defense, and countries and entities don't have the United States to support them. The question is, how comfortable do countries feel living in a region in which China gets to decide everything that you do? I've spoken to some leaders that say, that's better than war. But I will just tell you, the U.S. position is not that our futures are determined by foreign entities. And so that is something worth fighting for, I think, from the American perspective. And it looks like in Japan, they're getting there as well.
It was fascinating talking with Oriana. Now, she's been watching China very closely. And we also talked about if she thinks China is ready to attack Taiwan.
What you've just seen is just a part of the interview between Natalie and Oriana. If you'd like to see the whole interview, it's available on our social media pages. And if you like our content, please subscribe and follow us.
In terms of Taiwan's defense, the U.S. is Taiwan's greatest ally, and it's been working to gather support among allies in the region.
That's right. The U.S. has recently struck a new agreement with the Philippines to expand its basing presence in the region. If you look at a map, the Philippines is just southeast of Taiwan. Our partners over at Voice of America have more on the new agreement between the US and the Philippines.
Under a new agreement, the U.S. will gain access to 4 more Philippine military bases, in addition to the 5 the U.S. already uses. The U.S. has put aside over $82 million to upgrade the infrastructure at the Philippine bases.
I just want to be clear that we're not seeking permanent basing in the Philippines.
While the locations weren't announced, Philippine officials in November announced that the U.S. asked for access to military camps in Luzon, in the northern part of the Philippines, which is close to Taiwan.
The Philippines is also setting up their own marine littoral regiments, which will use BrahMos missiles from India, which will have about a 200-mile range. So you can imagine scenarios in which these capabilities are useful in ranging Chinese vessels, doing an amphibious landing of Taiwan, or blockading the island.
The Philippines could also grant the U.S. access to bases in Palawan along its western coast to help respond to disputes in the South China Sea.
Modernizing that alliance, networking it more with the Japanese and the Australian alliances, fits perfectly into this U.S. overall strategy of leaning more heavily on its allies and making those alliances more equal.
China said the U.S. move undermines regional stability and raised tensions in the region. China is now the Philippines' largest trading partner, and there are concerns the move could prompt Chinese economic retaliation.
I think this is where the Philippines will have to work with other countries in ASEAN to make sure that there would be some kind of support, from other countries in ASEAN as the Philippines try to do its share in terms of keeping stability in a more turbulent region.
US troops!
There is some citizen opposition to an increased military presence in the region. Many protesters say an increased military presence threatens to surrender Philippine sovereignty to the United States. Chris Casquejo, VOA News, Washington.
Well, Chris, I know you did your thesis on Japan's military posture in the Taiwan Strait. So what do you think about the recent changes in Japan's military posture?
I think that it's been quite a sea change in some ways. Japan, I think our audience should understand, has perhaps the most unique politics when it comes to defense policy. So much so that it's written directly into their constitution that they are not supposed to use war as a tool of the state. They've sort of gotten around that by saying that their military is only for defensive purposes, and that makes it legal under their constitution. But that has left them with very severe restrictions. For example, they are not allowed to have any weapons that are considered offensive. So right now they have no first strike missile capability, although there are now discussions about getting what they're calling a counter-strike capability. But the same technology that they would use for that could be used offensively. But it's a legal question for them. So it's a very big debate in Japan. Also, they've had very severe limits on their military spending. For decades and decades, it's been 1% of GDP. Very, very recently, just last year after the war in Ukraine, they have now proposed to double that over 5 years. So this is a huge change. So there is some potential for movement there, but there are still many political difficulties to any major involvement in a conflict.
Any other insights you got from Oriana's conversation with me?
Yeah, I did want to bring up that she mentioned that it's not clear if Chinese control of Taiwan is a threat to Japan. But I think that for me, the main issue there is energy. Japan imports nearly all of its oil and gas, and most of that comes from the Middle East. In order to get that oil and gas to Japan, it has to pass through Taiwan on one side or the other, either through the Taiwan Strait or the Strait of Luzon, which is in between Taiwan and the Philippine island of Luzon. If China controls Taiwan, they have a very strong choke point which they could use against Japan should they ever want to. Now, there may be some debate about whether or not China and Japan would ever get to a point where China would want to use that choke point, but the relationship between Japan and China is never been very warm. They often have diplomatic spats, to the present day over history issues and things like that. And with the more provocative actions on the military side that China has been making in the East and South China Seas, that's very concerning to Japan as well. They even have an ongoing territorial dispute over the Senkaku Islands, also known as Diaoyu or Diaoyu-tai by the Taiwanese. And in fact, that's a dispute they have even with Taiwan. So the sort of scenario in which I think Oriana would like to see Japan make these huge changes in their defense posture are maybe not that easy to make in the context of Japanese domestic politics.
Right. I mean, she did say that she didn't get a very warm welcome.
Yeah.
There,
I mean,
so.
I really think it would take a major event for them to make the kind of changes that she's probably advocating for. On the other hand, they are making some big changes. I mean, the defense spending is going up. Their capabilities may be going up. They're making new military agreements with the UK, with Australia, and so, and even the Philippines now. It seems that they are in discussions to increase their defense cooperation. So it's not that nothing is happening, but it just may not be as much as the United States would like to see.
All right, but it's good to see that countries nearby are concerned about Taiwan. Thank you for tuning in to Taiwan Insider. I'm Natalie Tso.
I'm Chris Gorin.
And do follow us on social media. We have YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. Follow and subscribe.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you guys, so please leave us a comment and let us know what you think.
Thanks. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.